Well, good morning, everyone. I was asked to start this session this morning, which is concerned with taking stock and exploring policy challenges coming down the road, by making some observations on three questions. How have things played out since the Pension Commission? What were some of the things that worried them then? And have they come to pass, or have they been avoided? Well, have things played out as the Pension Commission thought and hoped? The Pension Commission didn't cover everything. Its focus was on the serious underlying decline in pension saving and the three key strategic levers or priorities needed to rebuild a sustainable state and private pension system for the long term. Building a consensus for those three was challenging, and a lot of credit goes to Lord Turner for doing such heavy lifting to achieve it. Those three strategic dimensions were people needed to work longer, the ratio of years in work to retirement holding broadly constant over time with an increasing state pension age. 2, the state pension reform to provide a firm foundation for private saving, flat rated, maintaining its value with earnings. And 3, auto-enrollment of workers and a contingent employer compulsion on a default level of statutory contributions, with a default pension scheme NEST to deliver high-quality, low-cost provision for low to moderate earners, on the assumption that no reasonable system of voluntary incentives could reverse the decline. The consensus on those three has broadly held, and we're now seeing some positive outcomes. As the state pension age has gone up, people are working longer, but the rate of employment of people over 60 is still not sufficient to improve the ratio between those in and those not in the labour market. The state pension has transitioned flat to flat rate in 2016 and is tripled lock, a faster transition influenced by post-2008 events. Auto-enrollment is a success, with output lower than anticipated, embedding saving as the norm. The impact of staging 700,000 small and micro employers and two-phased increases in statutory contributions is still to be seen, but I actually feel optimistic that the outcome will be good. And NEST is clearly building successfully. So what were some of the things that worried them at the outset? That without a broad consensus across the public, employers and government as to the nature of the problem and what needed to be done, the decline in pension savings was potentially irreversible and pensioners in future would be significantly poorer. A concern that political consensus on pension policy would not hold and successive governments would make incremental decisions which would give poor outcomes over the long term. Reforms needed to address the disparities in pension saving that existed across the labour market, that market inefficiencies in private pension provision had to be addressed, for example, high charges, small pots, and the portability problem. A sustainable state pension system was influenced by the state's wider exposure to an ageing population and increasing longevity, for example, in health and social care. And the evidence on early departure of workers from the labour market meant a rising state pension age needed to be accompanied by higher employment rates for older workers. So, have those things that worried them come to pass or been avoided, or are they still to come? The evidence clearly confirms that it is now an embedded view in society that the auto-enrollment and saving for later life is a good thing. The cultural normative transition has happened. State pension has been reformed. Employment of older workers is increasing, attitudes are changing. Market inefficiencies are not fully addressed, but there have been some real improvements and NEST an increasing success. But the master trust regime is to work its way through, value for money is still work in progress, and small pots linger as a problem. Auto-enrollment has clearly extended pension saving coverage across the labour market. But gaps remain, and although the Commission made a reference to the emerging evidence of self-employment, it has clearly risen significantly, and 15% of the labour force is now self-employed, with a growing pension savings gap. The Commission's report addressed the decline in saving. It did not look at accessing pensions in detail, although it trailed comments on the functioning of the annuity market. It did not anticipate the radical freedom and choice policy of 2015, allowing savers to access their money in whichever form they preferred from age 55, a policy introduced at speed with no prior public consultation. Policy is now predicated on splitting pension saving into a saving phase and a drawdown phase. At the saving phase, inertia is harnessed in the face of complexity and behavioral biases which inhibit optimal decision-making. Regulated defaults, auto-enrollment, and default investment funds are applied. At the drawing down phase, policy assumes behaviors to be dramatically different, with the same individuals fully engaged, bearing this responsibility for making optimal choices. That is giving rise to further policy challenges as regulators consider how best to protect the consumer and help them make good decisions. There are currently few guided retirement pathways or default processes available to support good member outcomes, which is probably a good base from which to start on what is coming down the road, and invite the speakers for this session to join the platform. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and delighted to be here today to give you a very brief overview of this new benchmark publication from Vanguard and from NEST Insights. So the keen observer will look, and I count, by the way, all of you as keen observers. The keen observer will look at this title and say, how the UK saves 2018 member experience from the National Employment Savings Trust. Certainly what we know about NEST is not that NEST is a nationally representative sample of UK behaviors across the nation. But we mean this title in quite a different way. How the UK saves, that portion of the title, is an indicator of a fundamental shift in pensions policy in the United Kingdom. In the second pillar, from defined benefit to defined contribution, from voluntary supplemental to universal. And the second part of the title, member experience from NEST, is an indication of an important data point in that policy. And so it's in that sense that we mean the title, the transformation in pension policy and NEST's role in it. And if I had to leave you with really one idea to take away from today and from the data I'm going to share with you, it is that this report, I think unique in any global publication that I'm familiar with, shines a spotlight on a particular aspect, a particular component or segment of the labor force that receives pension provision when shifting from a voluntary supplemental system to a universal system. Last year, we spoke about the gig economy, but before the gig economy, there were part-time and full-time workers at small and medium-sized enterprises with no pension coverage. There were high-frequency, high-turnover jobs in the economy. There was seasonal employment. There were zero-contract hours or variable hour payment arrangements, pay arrangements. And those elements of flexibility in the UK labor market also provided significant hurdles to pension coverage, and you'll see in this data the solution to that particular problem. Just a word about the Vanguard Investor Research Center. At Vanguard, our mission is to take a stand for all investors, treat them fairly, and give them the best chance for investment success. And while we address investors across all domains, whether those be institutional, retail, defined contribution, or private savings, we're always particularly interested in the evolution of investment behavior within workplace pension schemes because of their sort of central role in providing financial security for the average individual or average household. And we're really delighted to be partnering with Will and the team on not only this publication, but on other future research to come. So one of the great advantages of a publication like this is you actually force yourself to go through the discipline of remembering the history of pension reform in the UK. And our colleagues have produced this wonderful overview in the introduction. I choose one slide from that to illustrate the point that we were just discussing, the rapid rise in pension coverage as we shift from a system that is voluntary and supplemental in nature to near universal in nature. You would see similar lines in the early 1990s in the Australian shift from a supplemental superannuation system to the superannuation guarantee system of today. You would see a somewhat more prolonged shift in New Zealand as new hire automatic enrollment was introduced in that country. You would have seen it a few months ago in the launch of a universal pension system in the state of Oregon in the northwest of America. And of course, you see it here with the pension policy shift and the introduction of NEST. So a little bit about NEST. Currently, NEST serves just shy, this data is as of fiscal year end, it's changed a bit, the current numbers, but as of the data points here, about 600,000 active employers across the nation, 3.7 million active members. Interestingly enough, over 6 million accounts, and we'll come back to the transitional nature of employment relationships in this population and the difference between those two numbers. Now, as you can see, what we've done here is just counted the number of employers by the postal code area, the 1 or 2 digits in the front of the postal code. The prominence of Northern Ireland is this one postal code area. That's really it. But you can see if you look really closely and blow this up, London, Birmingham, Manchester are highly represented as centers of employment, obviously, and centers of coverage. But the other thing you observe is sort of the widespread reach of NEST across the nation. Now, the interesting thing about, as I said, there is this conventional view that NEST employers are small employers, and you indeed see that in the dark blue, teal colors. Just look at that first line there. 57% of all employer relationships are with firms with 4 or fewer employees. But if you carefully look at the, gosh, these are such clever colors. I don't know, what color would you call that? Yellowish green. If you look at the yellowish, beautiful design colors, I just don't know. If you look at the yellowish green color and you add up, that's the fraction of members. And it turns out that 40% of membership at NEST is from relatively large-sized firms of 250 employees or more. Now, the way you think about this is think of a national employer who traditionally covers its more permanent workforce in a trust or contract-based scheme, but still has transitional or other transitory labor market relationships with another group of employees. Those are the sorts of employees at large firms who are enrolled in a program like NEST. So that's an important thing to recognize about the composition of NEST. Interesting note, the stereotype is retail, construction, health and social care. Those are the dominant types of employers. But you'll also see professional, scientific, and technical organizations, including some nonprofits, and financial services of all things as some of the leading employers in the NEST universe. Now, this is a lot of data on demographics, but I want to focus on 3 numbers in parentheses. The first 3 numbers on the left. The median age of NEST members is 38, so principally, nearly half of all members are millennials, and the rest, of course, Gen Xers and boomers. The median scheme tenure is 1.5 years, so very brief exposure to the pension system. As my colleague Cindy, who worked on the report, says, this is a startup system we're observing, and you can see that in this data here. But that also, besides the startup element of the system, this also reflects the high rate of turnover in these job relationships. And then finally, look at the median annual earnings of £18,500 or so. So that means half earning above that and half earning below that. And I'll draw your attention to the bottom line of this set of charts. This is member earnings. And you'll notice that only 26% of the NEST members earn above £25,000, meaning, of course, that the 3/4 of members earn below that amount. Again, highlighting this notion I said earlier, that this report has a particular spotlight on a unique element of the flexible UK labor market. Now, not surprisingly, and this is actually one of the, not surprisingly, 92% of the people who came to NEST in that first line on the right 92% of active members arrived at NEST through automatic enrollment. But the surprising result is that 8% didn't show up. They showed up through automatic enrollment. They showed up through voluntary choice. And when you look down the characteristics of those voluntary savers, you see they're disproportionately female, younger, and lower wage earners. In total, if you add up the voluntary choice segment, there are 250,000 members in NEST who have found through this program a source of voluntary pension savings. Now, many of them are below the 10,000 minimum, 10,000 pound minimum sort of pensionable earnings required for automatic enrollment. And you see that in the data. But it is this interesting phenomenon that merely the existence of a mandatory automatic enrollment system has created for 250,000 members a voluntary savings opportunity as well. So the big debate in behavioral economics, of course, is how many people will opt out of a default regime of savings. And we calculate two numbers for this purpose today. One is what happened during the staging process when automatic enrollment was first introduced at firms across the nation, inversely by firm size. And you see that the opt-out rate during the staging process was 11%. So that means for every 100 people auto-enrolled, 89 remained in the scheme and 11 left. Now, since then, once a firm has staged automatic enrollment for the first time, every subsequent employment relationship we count as ongoing enrollment. And you can see the actual opt-out rates are quite low at 6%. So pretty substantial improvement. And we'll continue to monitor this and track this over time, particularly as the contribution rates increase as required by law. Now, the other phenomenon, as you know, in the law, another characteristic of the law is that every 3 years, if you've quit the automatic enrollment scheme, we re-enroll you back into the program. You have a chance to quit a second time, or third, or fourth. And we have a very, very small sample of individuals. I mean, 0.2% of total membership. But interesting enough, the opt-out rate there is 13%. Now, to interpret this, remember, all of these people quit previously. And now 87% of the quitters are staying in the scheme for the first go-around. So we'll be very interested in tracking this number to see if this persists or whether it's more an anomaly of the data that we have on hand today. This is sort of interesting. We asked people in the data about why they quit. And we have this one set of we have variable results by member age. And if you look at the one line, I can't afford it, you see that's prominent among younger people under 25 to 34. If you look at I'm already saving in a pension scheme, that's more prominent among older households. So somewhat rational results, somewhat less rational results for necessarily quitting. Often the people who quit have a neighbor next door who's earning the same amount who remain. But nonetheless, that's the data on what we know about why people quit, and it seems to be consistent with what you would expect. Here's some international comparisons. Australia, with its mandatory system, obviously has participation rates at 100%. The data we see here on ongoing enrollment, an opt-out rate is 6%. In the US, automatic enrollment is voluntary at the firm level. We see, and we're looking at shorter tenured people here. That's opt-out rate of 7% or a retention rate of 93%. So very similar and on par with what you'd expect. Just as a benchmark, we included the 3-year tenure rate for voluntary enrollment plans. I'm sure that was true in the defined contribution schemes in the UK. In other words, there's the difference in pension coverage conditional on offering a scheme in the workplace. That's the difference between automatic enrollment and voluntary enrollment. And just a curiosity, is in Australia and the UK, most people tend to remain at the original automatic enrollment rate, but there is a tendency in the US for more people to switch out of that, and it's an interesting question to explore. Among the reasons, for example, in the US, you can partially opt out. You can go from being auto-enrolled at 6, but switch to 4, or you can go obviously higher, and we see both sorts of sets of behaviors. Now, what would you expect in a startup situation? Contribution rates are quite modest. So let's focus on the line that says median on the right. The median Contribution rate for all members is £142 per year. But note the distinction between individuals employed in the scheme or contributing to the scheme for the entire year, £300, versus those who have a partial period in the scheme. It's only £79. And again, that's another reflection of this high turnover part-time and full-time work environment for some. Balances are similarly low. Median balances for all members, £200. Median balances for active members, £278. Active members are those currently making contributions. So this is definitely, obviously in a startup phase, the small pot problem. You can see the distribution here. It's actually log normally distributed, as wealth often is, but there are actually obviously individuals with pension pots of 1,000, 1,500, or even £2,000 at the tail. Of course, this all begs the question, what will all this mean? This is the startup phase. And one of the things that the NEST investment team does is it prepares this long-term projection. Now, this is a close to 50-year forecast of outcomes in the future. And that's why it diverges over time geometrically. All these Monte Carlo forecasts get larger and larger and wider. But the median outcome suggests that in 50 years hence, we'll be looking at replacement rates for young workers of an additional supplement to the state pension of 30% of the state pension amount. And remember, this is monies that would not have existed previously, or if they existed, they would have, those numbers would be dramatically lower because accumulation would have occurred later in life. So it gives us some prospects for positive outcomes over the long run. One last thing I want to leave with you on contributions and balances is this interesting finding on women and men with respect to both balances and contributions. Let's just focus on contributions for a moment and look at the less than £10,000 category, most of these voluntary individuals contributing. And you can see that women, for a given level of income, contribute more than men, in fact, in this case, 31%. You see in the next line, £10,000 to £14,999, you see that, again, women contributing more than men. And this is an interesting phenomenon we noticed here in Australia and in the US, that in the aggregate, women have smaller pension pots than men. But the reason is that women earn less than men, not that they exhibit poorer pension behaviors. In fact, arguably, women are better pension investors. They tend to save more. They tend not to take extreme investment positions in general. But beyond that, so we're going to explore this a little bit more. There's lots of interesting questions here. Does this have to do with women's incomes being secondary to a household? How much does this have to do with the psychological difference between men and women? The Venus versus Mars question, as we call it in the research center. But we'll be exploring that, I think, in a separate research publication as we look at particularly the household structure. We have some data on investments. The important thing to note about NEST and the power of the default is that everyone's in the default, 99% of people in default. We have some data, comparable data from Australia. You see high rates of default. In the US, the use of sort of professionally managed defaults is actually rising every year. We expect that to reach 80%. So there's this global convergence that most individuals should be in some default strategy. So we expect to see that happen in the US over time. Let me leave you with one last question, which sets up a discussion that both Will started this morning and will continue this afternoon. I had my colleague the Vanguard Will, not the NEST Will, brought forward this chart from America data, which has to do with the loan feature within 401k plans. The interesting thing about the US defined contribution system is its dual purpose. It's used for both short-term consumption as well as old age financial security. And it raises an important question now that NEST has addressed this question of economic security in old age. How might it address the question of short-term liquid savings for households? And that's a topic for today's discussion. So thanks to you for the opportunity to present these results today. Again, high rates of pension coverage, very interesting voluntary effects, gender effects, and again, a lot of the behavioral dynamics that we would expect in a system of automatic enrollment and default saving and investing. Thank you.
Charlotte Clark. Could I invite Charlotte, who is the Director for Private Pensions and has overarching responsibility for delivering auto-enrollment. I think that's a job well done, actually.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeannie. I haven't got any slides. I thought what I would do is really just kind of give a bit of a view. I was going to say from government, but it's not really from government. I think it's from Whitehall, really, my perspective of where we are with auto-enrollment and what I see is the kind of some of the challenges to the pension system looking forward and how we might start to think about them. So where are we? Well, on auto-enrollment, every month we get this lovely stat through from our student about how many people have been auto-enrolled. So we're at 9.74 million at the moment, at the end of June. It probably won't pass any of you by that 9.74 million is awfully close to a very big number. So I'm not quite sure, I'm fairly certain it won't be July, but possibly August, September, we will hit 10 million people being auto-enrolled in this country, which is a massive achievement, and a massive achievement for so many people in this room of changing the culture, changing the savings culture in this country and giving largely low and median earners a chance to save for retirement. So those of you who understand the project and understand the program will know that we passed another big milestone earlier this year in finishing staging. So we finished staging, rolling out to all employers in February, which actually kind of went slightly unmarked. NEST had a party, because NEST always has parties. So with that staging done, the next big thing was obviously phasing. So a big phasing increase in April of this year, moving from 2% to 5%. I sit very close to the analysts, and there's a couple of them over there, and they're probably worried that I'm about to say something I shouldn't say. But I sit awfully close to the analysts in the auto-enrollment program. And I like to kind of wander over and ask them, whether or not we've got any kind of data coming through on what has been the phasing increase. And of course, I can already see Claire looking slightly nervous, but we haven't got the formal stats. But all the signs seem to be that actually that increase from 2% to 5%. I'm not going to say it's gone unnoticed, because I don't think, that's not quite the right kind of expression for it. But I don't think that we will see significant opt-outs from that. But, we will wait for the HMRC data, which comes through relatively quickly, actually, but to make sure that actually we haven't seen significant changes. But, in contact with most of the companies, they're certainly not reporting big changes for us. So I mean, that's where we currently are. When I start to think, we do have some kind of immediate challenges. One of the things that Tim Jones left us, I think, as a program, is a mantra that only the paranoid survive. And so, whilst, we're kind of getting ready to kind of think about, 10 million people and a kind of job well done, it is true that part of the good success of auto-enrollment is everybody from NEST, the regulator, colleagues at DWP, colleagues in the industry, never declaring success and always being on your guard. So we have that big increase from 5% to 8% due in April. We're also kind of thinking about how we take forward the auto-enrollment review. I often think in terms of when I think about, I've been involved in the program for a very long time. Occasionally I have breaks from it, but always come back. When I think about our original plan, and if somebody had told us and sat us down in 2006 and 2007 and told us the economics over which we would roll out this program, and indeed the politics over which we would roll out this program, I have a feeling Helen and I would have looked for other jobs at that point. But, we are going to increase, we're going to do the final increase from 5% to 8%. I think it's 1 week after we leave the EU. So, it will be an interesting time in which to see, that increase and what the economy is looking like at that point, and indeed what the political environment is looking like at that point. As I mentioned, we need to implement the auto-enrollment review. So I'm trying to see if there's people who are involved in the review for us. Yes, there are in the audience, but they did an excellent job. In actually a really difficult year, whatever you do, don't try and do an independent review and have an election in the middle of it. So, something I've learned. But they did an excellent job in just restating what are the things that we need to take forward. And I guess this kind of comes to the main part of what I wanted to talk about. When I start to think about what are the challenges we have left and how we best look at them. So I always think of pensions of, coverage, adequacy, protection, and engagement. So looking at each of those in turn, what are the big questions that remain for us? I should probably just take 20 seconds just to thank Jeannie and the Pension Commission, because so much of what we have done over the last 10, 15 years has been in pursuit of the goals that they set us. And that the work that the Pension Commission has done should never be underestimated in terms of its ability to give us a very clear direction about where we should be heading. It not only gave us that, but it also gives us, I think, a culture in pensions, which is slightly different from other parts of policy making, which is that good pensions policy is made on evidence and is made with consensus. And there are times when occasionally we break those rules. But, I think most of us who are in the area know that that's the case. And, looking forward at the challenges, whilst, I'm not going to say all the work is done that the Pension Commission kind of gave us to do, but certainly thinking about the challenges to 2030 and 2040, hopefully, with that kind of inheritance from the Pension Commission of, transparency, consensus, and evidence as our kind of guiding lights, we can really start to think about what are those challenges. So just thinking about them, so I realise I'm kind of running out of time. In terms of coverage, a couple of people have mentioned self-employed already. So who are the people who are not benefiting from auto-enrollment, which I actually think is one of the great successes of auto-enrollment, is people very rarely come to me to tell me that there's a group that's in that should be out. They now come to me to tell me there are groups that are out which should be in. And that is a massive change in the culture and the approach that we've got for retirement savings. So looking at the self-employed, looking at low earners, looking at carers, seeing whether or not how the system works for them and whether or not we can kind of improve their access to retirement savings. The next area is adequacy, and obviously we can have lots of discussion about 8% and whether 8% is enough. And Steve's slides on things like auto-escalation. I think auto-escalation is a fantastic idea, but as a policymaker and someone who basically does legislation, I just don't see how you legislate for it. That's my kind of, I can see how it's done in an employer. I just can't quite see the law that says this is how it works across the whole of a system. So I think the question has to be, well, do we change the minimum contribution? That said, I'm very open to that being the solution, because I think in some ways it's a lot easier than looking at the question about whether or not 8% is the right question, is the right level. And I think 8% is a particularly challenge, because actually when you start to have a look at some of the forecasts, for low earners, I think 8% probably is about right for a millennial who's kind of come in and has saved their whole life in an auto-enrollment system. I think the question is for those people who are outside of that, so particularly that Generation X, so people who will be retiring in 20 years and will not have a full life under auto-enrollment and probably are not going to benefit from DB. There's that group. And then also kind of looking at the middle earners and whether or not people, by middle earners, I don't mean middle earners, do I? I mean people who are on 50,000 rather than those that are on 20,000. That sort of group, and whether or not they will have the right retirement, and whether or not there is a role for government, for legislation in terms of supporting them kind of to save more. I'll talk very briefly about protection issues. Obviously, one of the things that's happening this year is the introduction of the Master Trust framework, but I think the bigger question is, what is a good DC? And I think, it feels at the moment a lot of our energy and attention in government is on removing harm from the pension system. And of course, that is incredibly important. I think that what is always very difficult, I think, from a government perspective, is actually promoting what is good. It's easier to focus on problems than it is to look at what might be system-wide solutions. But hopefully, I think over the next few years, a bit more of a discussion about what is a good DC, what are good investment options, what is good governance in this area is really important. And I'm sure, like many of you, I spent part of this morning flicking through the FCA report on retirement outcomes and looking to see there. But again, it's this sense of, well, we need to focus on the problems rather than necessarily what is a good retirement outcome. And I'm sure we'll have lots of questions about retirement outcomes, but it is one of the big questions that I think is there, which is around people at the moment don't seem to be making terrible decisions, but there's a big difference between not making a catastrophic decision and actually how do you make a good decision. And the difference between those two things, I think, is going to kind of be one of the big things that we debate over the kind of coming years. I won't talk about engagement, partly because I hate engagement. I think anyone who knows me knows that it's a word I feel ought to be banned from pensions, because we talk about engagement when we mean so many things. And imbue it with a kind of magical property. But I'm sure we will continue to work to engage with people and try to improve the customer service. It's my preference for the way we talk about this area, is how do we actually improve the service to customers and savers? How do we give them better information? How do we give them clearer information and allow them and support them to make good decisions? So I think that the final area is really, in some ways, it's the curse of the Pensions Commission. They have put the UK pension system in a much better place than lots of other kind of big societal problems. So whether it's social care or housing, the pensions solutions are kind of probably 10, 15 years ahead of those sorts of areas. So Jeannie is to blame for this. But one of the things that I think will be one of the big questions, and one of the reasons why I'm really interested in the NEST side-cost savings project, is how does retirement savings fit within other wealth and other kind of savings? So whether that is social care, whether that is housing, or whether that is rainy day savings, I think is going to be one of the big questions going forward. So I will end there, partly because I've massively spoken over my time, which frequently happens, unfortunately, I'm sorry. And just to pay tribute again, I think, to Jeannie and to NEST in terms of the questions that I have and that I think government will be focusing on over the next 5 or 10 years are not burning platform questions. They are, how do you improve the system that we have currently got? And that's actually not a terrible position for us to be in, and we should always kind of recognize that actually the strides that we have made over the last 10 years do mean that we are in a very good position to be answering these questions going forward. Thank you.
Finally, could I invite Jeremy Cooper, Chairman of Challenger Limited, an Australian investment management firm specializing in financial security for retirement. But actually, Jeremy is the Australian Lord Turner. He did the corporate Cooper review. Lord Turner did the Turner review, reviewing Australia's pension system, which was studied a lot in the UK to see how it could inform. So a coup to have you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeannie. Sadly, we don't have glamorous titles in Australia, so I'm just Jeremy, I'm afraid, notwithstanding that I've done one of these reforms. Now, this slide carries an advertisement that Challenger runs on television about retirement, which is quite a common thing in Australia. Visitors to Australia are always surprised at how we've turned pensions into, consumer desirable things that we see on television a lot. And I can guarantee you that this is not going to be an advertisement for how marvellous if you're thinking that this session is going to be all about how marvellous the Australian system was, you'd better go and have a cup of tea or something. So it is a little bit different. I'm just going to quickly run through what makes the Australian system different. You probably know all this. Then we're going to get to some of the things that we've really learnt, some of the challenges that we face with our system that is more mature, but it still has some important things that need doing to it. So the first thing you need to know about our system, it's compulsory. I'll get to how we did that in a minute. The main message for you guys is don't worry about it. Auto-enrolment is about as close as you need to get. It's working, so don't get too hung up on the compulsion part. And we also have quite a high contribution rate in that world. It's 9.5%, and it's on a pathway, albeit a slow pathway, to increase to 12% of wages by 2025. And we've also got pretty large scale. We have two, what you guys call master trusts, multi-employer trusts in Australia that have more than 2 million members each. So we certainly have got, a few things right, and certainly the scale challenge is one that continues to face the industry here. It's entirely trust-based. So when we set up superannuation, we basically said, well, it's got to be a trust. So we don't have the somewhat vexing issues around how the product is designed in this country. Is it a contract? Is it a trust? It's all trusts. We've also got the highest proportion of DC in any system. So we've gone further down the pathway. We've left DB behind. The coverage of DB was very limited in Australia, so we're the most extreme experiment, if you like, of the DC way of doing things. We also default insurance, so we have life insurance, which is really death insurance, and disablement insurance gets defaulted into your superannuation product. You can opt out of it, but that's the way we decided to do it. And I suppose we also have quite a strong risk appetite in Australia. It might be all those barbecues, it might be something else, but we do seem to take a lot of risk. And the other important feature of our system is that we've taken what you call SIPs, we've taken them vastly further, such that around about 1/3 of the total assets in the Australian pool are in the SIP world. And I often get told when I come to events like this that Australians really are crazy. You only need to look at that for the evidence. So let's quickly look at the compulsion things. It turns out we're absolutely experts on compulsion. So we were one of the first places in the British Empire to make voting compulsory. It's been compulsory in Australia federally now since 1924. When seatbelts became a thing, we just said, let's just force everybody to have seatbelts. We did that in 1970. And of course, so when superannuation came along, it was only natural that we make that compulsory as well. I'm joking a little bit there, but it was kind of a carpe diem moment. Think back to when inflation existed for heaven's sake. And it was a lot easier to sneak a 3% contribution from employers. And this is quite serious. It was a real political sort of carpe diem moment. So in rising ways, we had a centralised wage fixing environment in those days. And instead of granting a wage increase, we came up with this idea of a deferred wage increase. So that the 3% was sort of granted, if you like, to wages and then taken from them and put into the superannuation system. So that's how it all started. It won't be repeated. And as I said in the introductory remarks, I think auto-enrolment is as close as you need to get to compulsion. We engineered a very large, we're very keen on defaults in Australia, and so when I conducted my review nearly 10 years ago now, we're heavily influenced by the nudge guys, if you like. And so what you see today, effectively our default system, which we call My Super, whereas if you don't make a choice in the workplace, which most people don't, you end up in one of these funds. And we've got today a total of $650 billion happily sitting in those defaults. It's working well. We didn't opt for a fee cap, interestingly enough. We decided that market forces were going to do the work, and I think it's broadly equivalent. You'd see most funds coming in below the 75 basis point cap that you have in this country. So let's look at the good things about our system. Of course, compulsion overcomes the behavioural bias that we can't really see our future selves, and we tend not to look after them by not saving for our future selves. We've fixed that. I've mentioned how much we love defaults, and I think we've got the scale. We've made efforts in relation to governance, although that continues to be a bit of an ideological war, which I probably don't have enough time to talk about. We modernised the back office. We came up with a sort of straight-through processing. We sort of missed the digital age, and one of the key learnings, I suppose, is that we really missed the digital age in the early 90s, and there was a lot of very bad paperwork, very bad collection of data, which has kind of haunted our system ever since. So they're the good aspects. The not so good aspects, and yes, that is a pig. We have a government body called the Productivity Commission, whose mandate is to really review industries and see how they're performing, what sort of contribution they make to society and how efficient they are. And it's currently looking at our pension system. And this is an infographic as part of their report, which is really, I guess, using the sort of pig in the trough motif to describe our superannuation industry, which certainly didn't impress all of the good burgers of the industry when it came out. But the point is that the Productivity Commission has identified some chronic underperformers. So in a default system, you really need quite a bit of rigour around the things that are being delivered by the funds running those default products. And according to the Productivity Commission, there are some entrenched underperformers. It's kind of a lottery, and the thing about defaults is you don't know whether you've been lucky or unlucky. We've also, and I heard this mentioned before, this problem of multiple accounts. The Productivity have dubbed these unintended multiple accounts. So this is the account that gets stranded with you're at employer A and you move to employer B, and suddenly you've got two superannuation accounts. And these are unhelpful. They erode away your pension pot with fees and so on. And of course, in a system where you default insurance into the pot, you're also paying for insurance that may not be compatible. In fact, the Productivity Commission, in the same vein as their pigs in the trough, they call this zombie insurance. So it's insurance that may not respond to you because it has a term in the fine print that says, well, if you don't make a contribution for 12 months, you can't claim on it. So it is genuinely zombie insurance, and this doesn't reflect well on the industry at all. Because of the data problems I mentioned before, we also have a staggering 6.5 million accounts that are simply lost. They don't know who it belongs to, and that represents around about 18 billion Australian dollars. So a huge lesson would be to get the data inputs right, get the technology right, so that you don't end up in that kind of a situation. To solve, here are the piggies again, to solve this idea of the chronically underperforming funds, the Productivity Commission have come up with this idea of identifying a kind of top 10. We probably have a field of 40 or 50 of these default funds, and they've come up with the idea of an expert panel nominating the best 10. That's a highly contentious idea. It's fraught with all sorts of unknown potential behavioural problems, both for the the members who suddenly find that their fund is now not in the top 10, how are they going to behave? But also in relation to the funds themselves, whether you're in the top 10 or not in the top 10, what are you going to do if you're number 9? Do you just risk up and hope that everything works out for fear of being kicked out? These are all sorts of things that we don't know. But I suppose it's positive that these sort of ideas are being pushed at the industry in an effort to make it more efficient. Now, you can't have an Australian presentation about superannuation without a photograph of the political architect of super. That's Paul Keating there. He was the Labor Prime Minister that really came up with the idea of making it a mass and compulsory product. But he has mused recently that the superannuation system he designed was for 55 to 75-year-olds. Remember the time when we all thought we were going to retire early in the mid-50s, and the idea was that you roughly live for another 20 years, and a kind of DC-based system where you had a lump of money, you could even take that as a lump sum. It all made perfect sense with those sort of demographics. But in that 20-year period, life expectancies have just really shot up. So right now in Australia, a 65-year-old man, on average, his life expectancy is 87, and for females it's 90. And so effectively what's happened is we've had a sort of a demographic blowout. That the relatively simple idea of having a DC system that built up some money in the workforce, and that would improve your standard of living over a relatively short period of time is now under real strain. The next slide, I think I've made the data point. I think if I could contribute one thing, we really didn't do the data and payment metrics well. We had to come along at great expense later on and fix that up. So moving on. So what we find when we talk to retirees about what they want is naturally enough, because they've lived on a wage or a salary for a 40-year period, they basically say that they want a retirement paycheck. And this is such a big deal. This slide here is one of those sort of, morning programs that I'm sure you have in the UK, and there's one of these sort of celebrity economists explaining that this is really what retirees want. But it's not what our system currently provides. The DC system finds it quite difficult to provide a regular paycheck that lasts people for life. And the ad hoc spending of capital out of a static account is not the same as having a retirement paycheck. And so what flows from this? Well, my head of research recently divided up retirees into 3 critical categories. Those that were wealthy enough to be able to grow their savings almost irrespective of how much they spent. So that's the line that goes on upwards, and there are some people like that, not many. There are then those who can actually preserve their wealth, and this is the sort of wealth management industry is geared up around this world. So you build up some capital and then you live off the income for that, and you keep the corpus. And there are more people who can do that. But the mass market of people, and this is where your system is unquestionably heading, have got enough money to improve their standard of living in retirement, but they still have the risk of it running out. That's in the big yellow wedge, and that's what we need to think about when we think about these mass saving systems. So another message, and I won't labour on this one, is really, don't throw out all of your DB and annuity learning. When I think about our 2 systems, we're coming almost from an entirely DC system. We've got to the point where we're realising that DC can't do all the heavy lifting in retirement. You're coming from a DB and annuity world racing into DC land, and potentially we're meeting in the middle. So I think there has to be some role for longevity risk pooling in a DC system at the retirement end. Another issue that is one that we probably prefer not to talk about, but it's a little bit akin to the Paul Keating idea of just how old people are and how we still need to address their needs when they're in their mid-80s, late 80s and 90s. And we need to remember that the choice-oriented, quite complex DC worlds that we create and people are quite comfortable with potentially in their 50s and 60s don't necessarily work at the back end of retirement, and we need to think about how we might make that simpler. Sounds a little bit like a DB pension, doesn't it? This is a graphic that reminds us that we spend retirement savings generally as a household. So that is some household. That's actually Castle Howard in Yorkshire, for those who don't recognise it. But we have learned that in these individualised workplace saving systems, where legally it's an individual's money, we don't think about how people actually spend that money down in retirement. So in Australia in general, over 70% of people go into retirement in some form of couple. It doesn't have to be a traditional marriage, but it's a lot cheaper in retirement to be sharing the load with someone else. And when we think about adequacy and when we think about design, we think about the future in retirement, we should think about households, and then we should think more clearly about the inverse. So who are the people in their mid-40s who look like they're going to be going into retirement as singles, and we need to be reaching out, and I dare use the word, Charlotte, engage with those people, because they're in a very different situation from people who are likely to be in retirement as part of a couple household. I am mindful of time, so I won't labour through our relatively mundane policy. They're mundane for you because I think NEST is already thinking about some of the things that we are thinking about in retirement. So just in conclusion, what would I say that we've learned? Scale, governance, just about everything that goes wrong in a pension system or can be improved starts with governance, defaults, getting the data right. You know all this stuff. Don't over-dismantle your DB infrastructure and the thinking that goes with it. Pooling definitely has a role in retirement. Retirement is an incredibly different thing from saving it up. And I think we've learned that DC by itself is really just more of a savings mechanism rather than a retirement mechanism. And we're trying to blend this realisation that people are going to, in a mass market, need to spend their capital in retirement. How do we do that while managing their risks and in a smooth way? And just like in your country, our government obsesses about the tax concessions that have been spent on this capital, so they want it consumed in retirement. And we need to remember that really these are deferred wages. They don't turn into immutable capital. In Australia, we have this problem where people are treating their superannuation savings as endowments. They don't want to spend the capital, and the government is trying to force them to do otherwise. So I'll hand you back to the chair on that note.